you're trying to manage what it means for employees and what it means for customers. So we did, for a period of time, close our stores. For a period of time, they were open by appointment. We just tried to manage as we went through, given what the circumstances were, and being in 2 different states, Texas and Louisiana, that rules were different at different times, so we had to be flexible. But from a customer point of view, right, as we all know, it put some real hardship on people, and we tried to accommodate that. So we changed a lot of policies in terms of our normal process for promises to pay, to extend service. We greatly expanded that. For customers in sort of special circumstances, in cases we waived invoices. We let customers back on who were in the past our customers but went to national carriers and couldn't pay their bills. We reactivated their accounts. And but what we also did was for in some of the places we serve, we were the only wireless coverage that was good enough to reach people's homes. So Shelby County, Texas, the school district there, for customers to be able to go online and basically continue with school from there, there was really no other option. So we made a lot of accommodations for customers, and just as a general policy across the board, cut the price on our data 50%. So all the data packages were reduced in price to allow for the greater usage so that people could continue schooling and working from home.
And you make a good point. There are a lot of different usage patterns that sort of evolved. And Maureen, this is right down as chief customer experience for you, this is right in your bellywick here.
And we as a facilities-based quad play telecom, we actually focused on wireline initially and provided free internet service to anybody who didn't have it. We offered our existing customers an upgrade, so everybody took a step up. And in the span of about a week, designed all of this and made it happen. Additionally, we partnered with multiple school districts around the state to quickly get internet into low-income houses, and where we did not have wireline, we used wireless to supplement. So it ended up being quite successful, and obviously it was a challenging time for everybody, and we too faced the challenges with our employees and trying to make sure everything was safe for them and trying to take care of customers at the same time. It's an interesting, amazing time.
Mark?
Yeah, sure. Jonathan, you mentioned the flexible payment arrangements, right? And that's something, Steve, we talked about early on, and as part of the FCC pledge of keeping everybody connected, we also did the flexible payment arrangements and not charging late fees or disconnecting service, right? At the peak, we had over $800,000 of past due amounts, way more than the normal, right? And there was about 2,700 customers that were, made up that amount. Not gonna lie, I was a little freaked out, right? Are we ever gonna collect any of that? But at the end of the day, we only had to write off about $10,000, and there was about 6 customers. So it really was a win-win all the way around for everybody, I think, ultimately. And some of the other things we did is we added the extra. For customers that had data caps, we added extra data into their plan so that they could have additional services. We also launched e-commerce pretty quickly after, which we hadn't done previous, so we did that, and did curbside, all different kinds of things to try to keep keep serving our customers.
And Eric, anything to add?
Yeah. We initially it was a focus on partnering with the school districts throughout the service area. We put a whole lot of Wi-Fi that would serve the parking lot, so that those that didn't have a good broadband experience at their home, whether it was through their wireless or wireline providers, had at least somewhere they could go for that. And I believe we ended up having about 15 different school districts take us up on that. And we were really quick to get those deployed. We adjusted to the curbside, and we were pretty proud of the fact that we never had to shut down any of our retail locations and kept continuing to serve our customers and the way we always have, and that's in person and treating them like the people they are, not just an account number or anything like that. And I think it was we were very successful. We did in some of the less affluent regions of the state. We got a lot of the pucks for data for the folks so they could be doing the remote learning. And it was all about how can we continue to serve our customer. We continued to do in-premises installations. We adjusted some install practices that both protected our employees as well as protect the customer. And everybody was really pleased with that, and we had a lot of win-backs from some of the major providers, so I think it was really successful.
Yeah, good. I remember Mark mentioned the pledge, the FCC pledge. I remember telling the GPI that, our members, most of them took that pledge when they went into business, and that's what neighbors do for neighbors.
We were doing that before the feds came out with it. We
Yeah.
were really evaluating our own billing practices before they came out, because it is about taking care of your neighbors.
Yeah. Well, COVID showed us all that connectivity is huge premium for everyone, especially the communities and individuals. Can you sort of address this issue of broadband accessibility, and do you think all this new funds and new monies coming from Washington, D.C. for broadband is going to improve the process? Are we to the point that, listen, we need to use every tool in the toolbox to get ubiquitous connectivity? And I just happen to think that the regional carriers play an important role in that. Any thoughts, Mark?
Sure. So in our service area, there's about 500 different governments, whether it be counties, cities, villages, tribal, townships, whatever it is. And each of them have different needs in their communities, right, for broadband. And some really are being pretty aggressive with some of the funding that they're getting. And we're working with a number of agencies. We hired a new person to work directly with all of the governments, because there are so many, and to really understand what their needs are, right? So in the state of Wisconsin, there's been multiple rounds of broadband grant funding that we've been part of and we've been applying for. One of them, we've won quite a few of them actually, but one of them that in particular that I think is really interesting for us is, if you think about Wisconsin as a glove, at the very tip of the thumb, there's a little island called Washington Island. About 700 people live on that island, and they've had really poor broadband service, right? The landline provider, there was a point last year where they were just out of service completely for week or two. It was just amazing, right? So they really need broadband connectivity. So we worked with the county. We worked on the island. There's a electric co-op up there, and we all worked together, filed jointly for actually 2 broadband grants that we were successful in winning. And ultimately, what we've done is we've put fiber under the water to get up to the island, right? And with that, we will be using it for the Cellcom mobile service and actually adding sites on the islands. We already had one, but we'll have more. And the electric utility is going to provide fiber to the home with that same. So it's all of us kind of working together to try to come up with a solution that our rural communities need. And there's a number of those, and that's just one that I guess I throw out there and share.
Absolutely. And the territory, I mean, Eric, you and Maureen got huge territories to cover.
Well, where you say it's, all the tools in the toolbox, it really is about broadband in rural is not a cookie cutter. It's not one size fits all. It's not even one size fits most. It's how can you use and leverage not only the existing fiber or the new fiber, that we can play and get into closer to that end user. But wireless is a key to getting that last mile and sometimes that middle mile done, not only cost effectively, but especially where it's so difficult to get permitting over federal lands. It's a way to get to that end user without as much of an environmental impact. And each one is unique, and we need to be leveraging, the legacy landline that luckily we are. So we get to provide our own backhaul, and it's about getting the wireless, and really it's all about being a true telecom provider. It's not just being a wireless, not just being wireline, it's everything.
We have this big debate in DC about, 100 is symmetrical. It's got to be fiber. No, 100 down and 20 up with fixed wireless is good enough. But yet we have a 35 down and 3 up on a 5G standard and 25/3 on mobile broadband. Maureen, you guys have done some really interesting things, rolling out a 2 gig fiber ring, and then you're connecting all the tools, so to speak, as you try to service those multitude of little villages and everything throughout Alaska. Tell us a little about that.
Well, actually, to add to what they were just talking about, we also are in the process of 2 subsea fiber projects, one out the Aleutian chain, so think Kansas to California, give or take, and but all underwater with some offshoots, and then a second one up into Western Alaska. So we too are evaluating all of these different opportunities and partnering with different organizations, tribes in particular, to try to take advantage of what this is a tremendous opportunity that we've never seen before. But it's also a little bit gray in that there are a lot of new parties coming to the table to participate in this industry. And so it's going to be interesting to see what happens as these new players come in to build out. I think there's a tremendous focus on building and maybe not enough focus on operating. Like what happens once you fund something and it's built, then how do you maintain it going forward and grow as the technology changes? So it's going to be interesting.
Anything?
Well, we're not a fiber provider. We're just wireless. I hate saying just, but but I can tell you from our perspective, a lot of concern about the discussion in DC and how things are heading, with the emphasis on, what kind of funnels everything toward fiber. Wireless plays such a critical role when it's really stating all the obvious things in terms of reaching more places, reaching more people. It's such a critical component that even where there's an important need for fiber, at least for that last mile, to provide the security, safety, and entertainment, economic opportunities, all of those things, you need the reach of wireless, and this the emphasis, the amount that looks like is heading for wireless, to us seems really insufficient.
It was interesting when one of our friends and the lawmakers on the Hill was talking about, we need broadband for rural America, and he pulled out his phone and said, "This is the golden ticket. This is what we need in rural America." And I politely reminded the member that, just because you have fiber to the farmhouse doesn't mean you have connectivity in the barn or the feedlot or the back 40. You need a wireless network. And he stopped for a while and said, "Well, but I'm talking about broadband." I said, "Yes, there's mobile broadband and there's a fixed or a fixed wireless broadband." And it dawned on me that 97% of the people who own a smartphone or a phone would probably like it to work. So let's talk about USF, the need for review and maybe reform of USF. I mean, I think many probably saw our study that we did on CCA on RDOF 1, we recognized and identified over 289,000 spaces in the United States where RDOF funds, which is supposed to, go to rural areas, were funding areas that already had broadband. And so the FCC is dealing with that, I think, very effectively, and they've notified those that have probably without knowledge using the old 477 data didn't know that there was already broadband there. A lot of areas where there's not broadband, I think everyone in the audience would agree that maybe we don't need to fund broadband facilities on Cupertino campus with Apple, or maybe the MIT campus or downtown Chicago or Fisherman's Wharf. And so how are we going to look at these programs and start thinking about ubiquitous mobile connectivity? What do we have to do? Has the programs worked efficiently to date, or what do we have to rethink?
I think quite a bit. I mean, if you go back and start with the 96 Telecom Act, in my view, the program that was outlined for universal service made a lot of sense, including the portability of support, right? But the big brushstrokes in what happened from there, right? Portability went away. So the fund, by definition, then grew, and then then it got very political. Oh, look at how this fund is growing. It's not supportable. Wireless is taking too much. And at each key step along the way, it feels like wireless took a hit. And now here we are today, where there's still a tremendous need, right? There's lots of unserved and underserved areas. It's not just about 5G and high speeds and all, that next step, but the support is being taken away, or for example, the rules that require a certain percentage of legacy funding to be used for 5G. So there's this sort of inconsistency, problematic inconsistency, I think, going on, where you have on the contribution side, there's nothing from broadband providers, from internet companies, big tech companies, and then for those of us who provide the service and have been obligated for years to use those funds in an efficient and effective way that's defensible and consistent with the rules and report on that and all that, now we have to redirect that to supporting broadband. Well, in a lot of the areas we serve, the real need in these places isn't 5G, and at the same time, I think for most of us, we don't need an extra incentive or motivation or prod to go to 5G. The industry is going there anyway, but yet the funds can't be spent on what they were being used productively and appropriately for, and now have to be spent on something else. It effectively is a reduction in support. So I think it's very counterproductive. I think the rules need to be shaped in a way that makes sense for what the real objectives are. And on the contribution side, I think there needs to be some logic to how sufficient amount of support is coming in to support what most people, and I think most in government, agree are the objectives.
I mean, there's a lot there, and you mentioned contribution reform, which is getting more traction in Washington, D.C. I noticed the other day that Brendan Carr, Commissioner Carr, indicated interest in contribution reform. Mark, you talked about it there.
Yeah, so there's a Georgetown University professor that did a study on the universal service programs, and just basically coming out to the conclusion that it's not sustainable the way it's running now, and after 5 years it won't be working. So there has to be some fundamental changes to that. And the recommendation is that big tech needs to pay their share, and part of advertising that they collect, the Facebooks and Googles of the world, right? The advertising revenues that they need to pay in a part of that. That was the recommendation from the professor, that was the way to keep the fund running, is that had to be, was a suggestion. And it was very encouraging to see Commissioner Carr come out last week and state that he supported that, as a solution to the problem. And I've heard from other folks that there could even be, I know this is a weird thing to say, but bipartisan support in that kind of a thing, right? I mean, so I mean, which would truly be amazing. But it's really ultimately needed, because in order to get people connected that need broadband in particular, right? We need something meaningful in the $30 to $50 range per month to get those that need it to be supported, and you got to fund that somehow, some way. So I think that makes tons of sense.
Yeah. Did you find the same thing, Eric?
Oh, absolutely. I think we definitely need the reform not only on where the money comes from, but where it's going. And as it was stated by one of my colleagues up here, it's not just about building it, it's about maintaining it once it's built. Where you're dealing with, for myself and our network, the extremes of being in the middle of the Rocky Mountains, things break and you have to fix them. And everything's kind of at an extreme difficulty level to do that. And what's going on today is just not sustainable. And it's good to be looking for new sources, better sources. Everybody uses the network. Now how do we get the funds to help maintain that network and share in that ecosystem, rather than just the legacy sources, right, which they're getting depleted. I think we've had way too many years of those self-defining prophecies of we need to reduce funding, and now look where our infrastructure's at. It's about sustaining that, not just for the first cost, but the lifetime of the network.
And that's a good point. We had a supply chain workshop yesterday, and one of the things that reoccurred several times is, we're talking about replacing networks that have covered equipment, but you have to remember the long-term, not just the CapEx, but the OpEx. And so what we're talking about contribution reform is that's look ahead to 5, 10, 15, 20 years of how you sustain not only that growth, but modify and continue to improve the network. And that's one of the things I think is a challenge. I hope Mark is right, that hope springs eternal in Washington, D.C. We can find some bipartisan consensus on that. But I'm glad that carriers are looking at not only the funding source, but the contribution reform. We've got a bill pending in Congress now, $42.5 billion, sort of focused more on fiber solutions, although fixed wireless and mobility can be used. We were successful in pursuing $1 billion for middle mile, which is clearly fiber to the tower, and I think our carriers could take advantage of that. But there was an article just this morning that there's almost $300 billion over at Treasury, that states and localities and communities are going to get a portion of it. And for me, one of the limiting factors has always been your CapEx has to have a return on investment. Now we're talking about partnering with local communities, governments, facilities, emergency responders. It seems that that's sort of in your sweet spot, knowing the areas that you serve. You mentioned that you're working with local communities. Is everyone else looking at that partnering concept as we look to all this money coming out of Washington, D.C.? What about private LTE enterprise type of strategies to not only extend fiber, but also own your market, so to speak? Anybody looking at that?
I mean, we've been looking at it for a while, trying to figure out how we play in that space, and we're still looking at it. We don't have definitive plans at this point, but definitely looking at it as an opportunity.
On this one, I almost wonder if we missed the boat. I don't know yet on the private LTE networks. I think there's a lot of opportunity out there still, whether it be larger education institutions, whether it be different industries. I know, most of our coverage area, we always joke we're a mineral extraction state, a bunch of earth firsters mentality, we'll exploit Earth's resources and then worry about the other 8 planets. Sorry, couldn't resist myself. But right now, all those industries are dying, whether it be through new administration directions, but oil and gas, it's not the fact that oil and gas isn't there, it's just the fact that they claim there's not as big of a need, although I can't figure that out at the gas pump. Prices today seem to be a little bit steep, but it's with those industries dying, which are really the bread and butter of our economy in our state. I don't see the money to invest and to sustain itself with those private LTE networks, where maybe 5, 6, heck, even just 2 years ago, there was a much better opportunity to get them started and get them embedded to cover that initial CapEx, and then the OpEx just kind of helps sustain itself. So I wonder if we didn't miss the boat a little bit.
Yeah, I think Eric makes a good point, because a number of things have to intersect for there to be a good opportunity. And I've sort of felt like private networks is one of those things, like so many in our industry, that gets talked about for years and years, but it always seems to take longer until the economics align. And so it seems like the economics are becoming more viable these days, but that's got to sync up with the opportunities, and it's obviously different in different markets. We have a lot of oil and gas interests in our markets, and one of the other things that happens, at least to us, when things get a little tighter in the economy, is the responsibility gets pulled out from the local market back to headquarters. So customers we used to have that we do business with in market, all of a sudden the decision-making authority is in Houston. It gets pulled out to Dallas. And so I don't mean to be totally negative about it. I think it is getting to be a great opportunity from the perspective of the technology and the industry and the pricing getting ready. For all of us, we have to match it up with the opportunities in our individual markets. And if it's not a great time with oil and gas, some of us serve other places where it is a better time. So I actually think it's going to, on net, start to be more positive and more viable and a good opportunity
as the economy gets better also.
As the economy gets better also, but just the net effect of pressure on some sectors, but that's not every sector.
We can't have a conversation without talking a little about spectrum, the lifeblood of wireless. And on the policy front, some ideas or thoughts on how we need to make sure that spectrum is available and accessible by small regional carriers to continue to compete? I mean,
yeah.
Mark, you're a spectrum guru.
So our customers are increasing their data demands by about 20% per year. Okay, that's just what it's been and what it's looking to continue to do. So the way we look at ways of how do we keep increasing the capacity in our network to meet those demands, and one of the big ways is through spectrum and putting more spectrum to work in the network. This year, we will probably be adding additional spectrum to existing cells. About 25% of our existing cell sites will put additional spectrum onto them just to try to keep up with the demands. And that's not the end, right? It just keeps going. And in order for us to be able to continue to do this, we need to have more affordable spectrum. And as we look at FCC auctions, sometimes the PEAs that they come out with geographical just don't work for us. They don't work for us at all, right?
Especially west of the Mississippi, they do not work. They're too big.
Right, they're too big.
And they don't meet the existing licenses that we have today. It's screwed up.
Right, and it might include some large urban area, which the major carriers would want, but they don't care about where we are.
No, and they're not building it out.
Right, so that doesn't work for us. I mean,
Get the blocks in smaller geographical areas. I said this years ago, spectrum is land. You cannot do a crop without land. And for a carrier, it's all about the spectrum you have. I have no desire to be in the Denver market. I have no desire to be in the Salt Lake market. Yet, you look at how some of the geographical blocks are today, I would have to have the money to get into there to compete for the spectrum.
Yeah.
It needs to be much more manageable sizes for the entire ecosystem, not just what the big 3 want or whatever. It's got to be for the entire industry. And we'll use it as much as anyone, hell, we'll use it more than they will.
In the rural
areas,
right?
absolutely.
Of course.
And CCA had to fight just to get us PEAs.
Yeah.
The
Right,
fact that they
that's-
didn't even want to go to PEAs originally is, okay, I'll shut up.
Yeah, I think that's one of the big challenges, is in an environment where you have to fight to get these spectrum geographic areas that, we struggle to make work, and in some cases just don't work. How do we get it to be more sensible?
Yeah, and it's tough when the policymakers start out saying, no, counties are not an option. Multiple counties, PEAs may be the smallest division that they're willing to look at. Some has suggested that secondary market could actually help if there were incentives for the larger carriers that own the largest blocks, could release some of that spectrum into smaller markets without being penalized for build-out requirements that were originally attached to the original auction terms and conditions. And yeah, that's sort of difficult and messy, but it's one way of maximizing utilization of the spectrum, and also recognizing that the larger carriers have probably met their build-out requirements in terms of proportionality of either geographic or a population, and there's opportunities here to work with local communities and our wireless carriers. So to be continued another time in Washington D.C. But it's good that we're seeing more mid-band spectrum. I mean, we're working on the CBRS deployment scenarios, 3.45, which we're not going to talk about because we're in the anti-collusion rules, but 3.1 to 3.45 is in one of the bills that Congress is considering now, so that may be coming, and as you know, 2.5 was available, as well as C-band. So we're seeing more spectrum than we've seen in a long time for build out, which will allow you to hopefully get to 5G a little faster. Speaking of 5G, let's talk a little about 5G in rural America. One of the tools we have at CCA is we have an industry development program, but it's driven by the Business Innovation Group, the BIG, as we call it. Kim Cronchi chairs that for us, our vice president. And Mark and Maureen co-chair the BIG, and it's carriers only, so they can sit and talk about what are the top challenges that they experience in doing business. And then we share that, we do an annual survey, and we share that survey with CCA associate members, vendors that are supportive of CCA, so that you see what the top priorities are from the carriers themselves. And then we try to marry our vendors and associate members that have those capabilities, that are CCA members, with our carriers. So hopefully we cut down on your shoe leather that you have to spend to get, for example, on robocalling, we did an RFP for our carriers. We had 9 responses laid out for every one of our carriers to look at, so they had real choices. And I think it's unique to CCA. I think we have made a lot of progress, but clearly from the survey, 5G, IoT, VoLTE, top priorities. How's it going with our exploration of how we get there on the regional side? Especially on the consumer side, Maureen, and how important is it that our small carriers are in a position to offer 5G type of services?
Hugely important. We launched 5G in 2020 in the middle of a pandemic. We actually were able to stay on our plan to deploy, and we launched it in Anchorage. So we now, for those that don't know, Anchorage is about half of the population of Alaska. So we now have 50% coverage of in the state of Alaska in the northernmost 5G network in the United States. And we are now evaluating where we extend the market. We're going north into the Matsu Valley, which is just an hour north of Anchorage and a huge population base, but it does become challenging from a financial perspective. We cannot afford to put 5G out everywhere in the same way that we have done it in Anchorage. So we are continuing to evaluate how to do it in the best way. I will say this, we have seen considerable customer growth since we deployed, and I highly encourage other carriers to look at being first in your market to get to 5G if you can figure out how to do it, because you will definitely see the benefits of it from a customer growth standpoint.
You know, it wasn't too long ago in Washington, D.C., it was, oh my goodness, we need to win the race to 5G. And then we have all this money going to fiber. I think the next challenge is how do we get wireless, ubiquitous 5G connectivity? And that's one of the policy issues that the CCA is going to wrestle with coming forward. The other thing is IoT. That has been a huge issue. And the issue of having a platform that's ubiquitous nationwide, because not all of our small carriers have an opportunity to do NB-IoT or narrowband IoT, designated spectrum, either guard bands or otherwise. And Mark, you have been looking at LoRaWAN type of capabilities, and we have several new members that are actually offering those type of services, capabilities. Could you share with us some of the things you're doing?
Yeah, so with the LoRaWAN, we had the University of Wisconsin Green Bay started talking with us, and they have been historically very heavily involved in environmental sciences in that area. And one of the things they wanted to start doing with their students is start looking at the Bay of Green Bay, the water there, and it's part of the Great Lakes, water table and water. So it's a massive freshwater initiative that they're looking at, but specifically in the Bay. So we've deployed all throughout the Bay of Green Bay LoRaWAN technology, and they're putting buoys in with LoRaWAN sensors in them. So they will be measuring the temperature of the water from the surface all the way down to the floor of the bay, and they'll be looking at turbidity and algae and plankton and all these kind of things, and they'll be looking at just sensing everything. And the students then can in real time be looking and collaborating and analyzing data, and it's just an exciting opportunity. And LoRaWAN, if you're not familiar with it doesn't cost huge amounts to deploy. The actual equipment for the towers it isn't expensive, and there's not spectrum issues either. There's spectrum allocated for that. So something that I encourage people to take a look at. It's an interesting, and once we have that, then we're looking at additional ways to put that into play, right? And we're looking at some agricultural things right now. We've joked a lot over the years about doing sensors on cows, but this is coming up again, right? And it's an opportunity that some of the more expensive IoT plays, it gets hard to do it that way. So.
Well, that's music to Eric's ears. He's got more cows out there than people. And
I've heard that rumor.
and he told me he figured out how to get 600,000 new customers. They all are four-footed customers, but...
There's over 1 million cows in Wyoming.
Oh, okay.
They actually outnumber us about 3 to 1. It's kind of nice.
So having a platform that you can provide 5G type of services is going to be important for our carriers. So do you need 5G, true 5G, SA standalone or NA non-standalone? Or can you provide 5G type of services gradually through a 4G LTE VoLTE platform and mature it into a 5G? What's your game plan in that regard? And I know that Maureen, you guys already have some 5G, and I assume you're going to try to pull in other community-based services. So what's the business game plan on 5G? Jonathan?
I think of the two, it's the latter makes sense for companies like us anyway, that it takes time, and just like every evolution in technology, we sort of see our place as the followers. We're not the cutting edge. The newest things are happening in major cities from major carriers first, and that creates opportunities for smaller carriers, but not so much the immediate necessity to do and offer the same thing. And obviously too, it's a different economic picture. It's not just lower population density that you have to consider, but the build challenges, the differences, the terrain, the fact that for a lot of us, the networks are built on a low band spectrum grid. And so the idea of the use of mid-band and high-band spectrum, that'll take some time to develop in some more sites, and it'll make sense in some places and not in others. So I think we see it very much as an evolution. And at the same time, real quick, I think we have a little bit of a benefit too in buying some time, which is, a lot of the broadband experience is dictated not just by the technology, but by the relationship between your bandwidth and your number of customers. And in rural, lower population density areas, we operated for a long time at 3G when some of our competitors were at 4G, and we had better data speeds than they did because their networks were loaded differently. So I think the same dynamic will apply, at least in places here, that gives some time for economics to improve and carriers like us to evolve into 5G.
We have a few more minutes, and I did want to...
I can kind of jump in on this, maybe a little different perspective on 5G. I mean, the engineer in me really says, ooh, bright, shiny, cool. Yeah, this is great. Yeah, what's the point of owning a Ferrari if you don't have a road to drive it on? It doesn't matter the technology if there's nothing there to sustain it, to make it work. And there's enough places that we still need to focus on getting that first iteration of coverage. There's enough need for getting just basic data. Why are we all concerned about having the latest, greatest, bright and shiny when what we really need is something that works and works well and reliably?
Yeah, getting back to the 5G fund, there's $9 billion identified in the 5G fund over the next 10 years. We think that the RDOF 2 should be redirected to a 5G wireless program, and we ought to review how do you get to 5G. You're absolutely right, and so we got a bunch of policy challenges ahead. Before we end up here, supply chain issues. I know that Maureen has indicated that automating your customer service, being able to bill for multiple types of services, unique services that billing systems haven't in the past. Creating your own solutions is sort of overwhelming for smaller carriers. How are you really providing these services, expectations to the consumers, when it's very difficult you can't go to the shelf and buy this stuff. Everybody's network and billing system is different. how's the challenges associated with that?
Well, there's one significant challenge that I think we're all facing, and that is around handset availability, and certainly in the short term, that we are going to continue to navigate that. I think the second part of your question is referring to things like e-commerce, which Mark, you indicated you guys launched during COVID, and the challenges that we, especially around e-commerce, that it's not scalable. So the effort that we have to put into an e-commerce platform is identical to the same as what the big carriers have to do, yet their pockets are much deeper. And so we are always scrambling to figure out how to create an online e-commerce experience that is what customers expect, that doesn't bankrupt us to provide it. So it's an ongoing challenge for certain.
Anybody else?
Yeah, and because we have different billing systems and they need to integrate with the billing systems, what we're developing won't help you, Maureen, right? It just doesn't, right? It's completely different, unfortunately. So.
One last question. We got about a minute. Okay, Maureen, if you were Empress for the day, what challenge, what problem would you fix that we all would benefit from?
Oh my goodness, thank you, Steve. You just tossed me up a softball. I would say this. You've heard me say this before. I think as an industry, we have an opportunity to continue to focus on diversity, equity, and inclusion. And there's ample evidence that companies and organizations that are diverse and bring diverse thought to the table are much more financially successful, and I think we should all be focusing on that. We as a company have taken that on as an initiative, and I hope that others will do it too.
Yeah, good for you. Eric? Emperor for the day.
Emperor for a day? Yeah, I don't want to be Empress for a day, just for the record. I don't know. I think there's so much opportunity out there, and especially as rural and regional carriers, we need to be it's really about the teamwork that we do. We each have our own niche that we have to fill, and I think we need to be focusing on how we can do that better and quit fighting over the scraps that we feel the bigs are leaving us. This is really about us providing those personalized services to our customers who really, they deserve it just as much as anyone else, if not more.
Jonathan?
I think on the topic that gets so much attention these days about all the different funding programs and broadband support and USF, if I could change something that would have a benefit for us and everybody here, I think it would be to make that truly accessible. So we've faced so many different issues with the rules, and we talked about how in some cases there's eligibility issues and how much is going to fiber versus wireless, but there's a huge amount of money that's available and a general agreement on the need for broadband in the country. My gosh, can we just say that if you can demonstrate an area is unserved, that support will be made available to deliver service to that area? I mean, if we could have that, we know our markets, we know where the places are and the opportunities are, certainly much better than national carriers do. So if we could have that support actually be available and let us go out and do the work, I think we'd make tremendous strides.
We'll finish up with our chairman of the board, Mark Nazé.
Thank you. So kind of related to what Jonathan is saying, but maybe a little bit different angle of it. There's our rural customers need the services that the urban customers get, right? But we don't have the scale. And sometimes the cost of some of these just doesn't scale well. So if I could change something, I would change that, that we could be affording these things in a scale that makes sense for us, right? So.
Well, after Alaska files to annex Washington, D.C. in your effort to expand your ever-growing footprint, maybe we'll have some solutions, common sense solutions coming out of Washington. Listen, thank you one and all. Let's give this panel a rounding applause. We're going to clear the room. We're going to have the annual meeting in this room in 15 minutes. And then at 12:45, we'll be back in here to hear some really interesting presentations from many of our Pinnacle sponsors. You see them all up there on the wall: Ericsson, Inrop, Mavenir, Nokia, T-Mobile, TNS. We thank them. Without their support, we couldn't have such a, I think, elegant place to come visit. So thank you, one and all. See you in 15 minutes right here. Thank you.